Good morning, everybody. I am Carol Otherell. I am the director of the Indiana Deafblind Services Project. I want to welcome you to today's virtual workshop for families, CHARGE syndrome after 37 years. Without any further ado, I am so privileged to welcome David Brown this morning. My background, it looks like the Aurora Borealis, maybe, but it's supposed to signify David is out in California where it's very early, and I'm going to say that's nighttime sky. He might say it's smoke in the sky, but anyway, we are so happy to welcome David, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Carol. Good morning, everyone. It's 7 o'clock here, and it would be dark anyway at 7, but we have so much smoke around that it's particularly dark. I did 2 webinars for the Indiana project yesterday, and as always, when I do a webinar, I felt a great loss of personal contact with people. The chat box is very useful, but it's not really a great substitute for being in a room with people right next to you. So do use the chat box if you wish to. I try and keep on top of the chat box if you have questions. But as Carol said, at the end of this session, we can go back through the chat box in case there are issues I missed and things I didn't see. I'll tell you a little bit about me. I'm a teacher. I'm obviously from the United Kingdom originally, and I joined the Deafblind Association in England in 1983. And the very first child I met was a 10-month-old baby boy with this new condition called CHARGE association. He was probably the first child ever diagnosed in England. And I worked with him for about 5 years. And I remember being fascinated and puzzled by him because in some ways he seemed very bright, and in other ways he didn't seem very bright at all, and he had some strange behaviors. And that was my introduction to CHARGE 37 years ago. Since then, I've obviously worked with lots and lots of children with the syndrome. And in 2000, because of problems with my managers in England, I was looking for another job, and there was a vacancy on the California Deafblind Project, and it was a crazy thing to do. But I remember writing to them and saying, "Can you tell me about the job?" And about 7 months later, I flew to San Francisco. I came just for 2 years. And at the end of the first year, they asked me to stay another year and another year, and it just went on and on and on. So I've been here just over 20 years now. I retired five and a half years ago, but I still do a lot of consultancy work like this. And I realized last year that I was staying, so I got US citizenship, which it was very ironic given that I only came for 2 years, and here I am. I'm not just here, but now I'm an American. I'm very interested in CHARGE. I'm very passionate about it, but I have to say that when people say I'm an expert, well, okay, but I'm very conscious of what I don't know. And there's an awful lot of things about CHARGE I don't know. And I'm thinking particularly of children as they get older. And I'm thinking of behavior and the whole emotional side of those older children. And I'm doing some consultations later today with individual families. And it's interesting that this issue of emotional behavior and everything around it is going to come up in those consultations. And we are really floundering trying to come up with solutions. More than anything in CHARGE, we need a good neurologist who's interested in CHARGE. We have ophthalmology, audiology, endocrinology, pediatrics, cardiology. We have a lot of great medical specialists really interested in charge, but we've never found a neurologist. This is my email address, and I have to be honest, sometimes it gets too busy and I miss things. But if you need to contact me at any point, that's my email, welshgold@gmail.com. And I'm going to begin by showing you some pictures. And I like to show these pictures. They will probably be very familiar to you as parents. But when I'm talking to professionals, like I was yesterday, these pictures come as a huge surprise. These pictures are of a boy I met in the Netherlands 2 years ago. He's 6 years old. And like so many of the children, sometimes he seems very bright and very smart, and sometimes he seems completely the opposite. They've taken a break in school, and this is him relaxing by standing on his head and his hands. He's barefoot because he won't wear anything on his feet at school. Here's a typical posture, curled forwards on a chair, head on his knees, and his feet wrapped around the legs of the chair. Here he is squeezing into a tiny little cardboard box. He does a lot of squeezing. Here he is hanging with his arms over a swing. Here he is on one of the teacher's stools, and he's leaning over and pushing himself around the room. They did a gardening session, and this is him with a wheelbarrow, practically standing on his head in the wheelbarrow. This is his preferred way of wearing his backpack. He likes it on top of his head, and the straps are under his armpits. So the bag is being pulled down hard on top of his head, and his arms and shoulders are being pulled up very tight. And here he is again on a swing, upside down with his head and his hands on the floor. And all these postures are fairly typical of children with charge. They all come from the multisensory impairments that the syndrome has. And I like to look at children doing things like this and ask myself, what kind of sensory input is this child getting from what they're doing? And very often what they're looking for is deep pressure or deep stretching or deep twisting. And there's a great need for that, which I will talk about a little bit today. I talked about it much more yesterday. It's hard for me to know, because I don't know you, it's hard to know what to do. You don't really need Charge 101, I'm sure, but there are things that can easily get missed. So I've put them in, and if you write in the chat box something you'd really like me to address at some point, I'll try and make sure that I do that in the time available. One of the great things now is the resources available. When I met that boy in 1983, there was nothing about charge. And I went to the British Medical Association library, and I found 3 medical articles about charge, all very negative. They all said the children were severely mentally retarded. All 3 articles said that life expectancy was very poor, and the articles didn't fit with the boy I was working with. They didn't seem to make sense. And then over those 37 years, very gradually, but now fairly quickly in the last 10 years, there's been a great flowering of information. The Charge Syndrome Foundation, of course, is the main focus for resources about the syndrome. Wonderful organization. Interestingly enough, it was founded by 3 professionals whose goal was to hand it over to parents and family members, and they managed that triumphantly. So apart from the first couple of years, it's been an entirely parent-run organization. Their website has all sorts of great stuff. And of course, they organize the big 2-yearly foundation conference, which if it happens next year, will be in Arizona in either July or August. Then Perkins School for the Blind outside Boston. That's the school that Helen Keller went to. They have a lot of students with Charge syndrome, and they filmed a series of webcasts, little 20-minute talks about Charge, which are good, partly because they're only 20 minutes long. And there are about 10 of us who went there and filmed these little talks. There are 2 Charge laboratories run by psychologists. The Charge Lab in Central Michigan University is run by Tim Hartshorn, and I'm sure you've come across Tim. He's a psychology professor, but he's also the parent of a young man with Charge, who's not so young now, actually. I think his son is in his mid-20s already. And then one of Tim's students, Casey Stratton, got a job when she graduated. She got a job at Mississippi University, and her Charge laboratory is called the Bulldog Charge Lab. And they, I'll say a bit more about them in a moment. They do a whole range of research. Cincinnati Children's Hospital has a Charge clinic. It's really the only Charge clinic in the whole United States. And I know now families are traveling long distances. They're flying to Cincinnati in order to get their child evaluated there. It's a fascinating group. I've been there twice. I accompanied a family through a day there, and it was superb. They asked me for criticisms, and I couldn't criticize anything. And every medical professional you meet in that clinic knows about Charge. You don't have to explain things. You don't have to describe things, because they know the syndrome. They've also had 2 conferences, and they have a virtual conference coming up, I think, round about now. I can't remember. The National Center on Deafblindness has a huge website full of information and resources, much of which is useful for anyone working with a person with Charge, but there is actually a section on Charge on their website. Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired has information on the website, including information about Charge. My old agency, California Deafblind Services, has quite a lot of information that's relevant to Charge, including about 5 articles that I wrote when I was working for them. My old agency in England, Sense UK, has a Charge information packet on its website, and that might be worth looking at and downloading, or giving the link to your professional team so they can get information from a slightly different angle. Deafblind International, which is our international organization, has a Charge network, which is not very active at the moment, but there is an international network. There are books available. These are, on the left is the American book, which is just about to be republished. They've done a major rewrite, and the book hasn't come out yet. I think it's coming out early next year, and that will supplant this one. This book is, I think, 11 years old. The other book, the compendium, is actually a German book, but it's all written in English, which is interesting. And then there are 2 more books. The one on the left is a German book, which is in German, but since there is a book in German, I thought I'd show it to you. And the other book, Why I Am Me, was produced by the Australia-New Zealand Charge Family Group, specifically for people with Charge. It's a book that you can use to help your child understand Charge, but also it's been used a lot to help professionals understand Charge, and it's a good book. Although it's written for children, it's actually good for anybody who's interested in the syndrome. Oops. Facebook, of course. I'm on 6 different Facebook pages about Charge, including one in German where I use Google Translate to help me make sense of things. And that is the greatest resource of all, in my opinion. You have a particular problem or a particular question. If you post on some of those websites, if you're lucky, you'll get parents all over the world responding with their experience, their stories, what worked, what didn't work, and so on. And then last year, I got involved with a project from Australia called Understanding Charge Syndrome. This is a teaching module. It's available free. It's long. There's a lot of information. I'm not totally happy, but I was one of the people involved, and they called us the top 10 charge syndrome experts. Well, you could debate whether we're the top 10. We are people who know charge, and we're very passionate about it, but I wouldn't say we were the top 10. It quite amused me when I saw that, and I thought, oh God, I don't want anyone thinking I'm in the top 10 of charge experts. But anyway, it's there, and there's a lot of information there. So that's a list of resources. The American Journal of Medical Genetics in 2005 produced a whole volume just about Charge syndrome, and that is on the Charge Syndrome Foundation website. And then a couple of years ago, they produced another volume with a whole lot of different articles. They're mostly medical articles, but again, you might want to refer your professional teams to them. And this is what's in the new edition. Things like genetic counseling. I was one of the writers on the behavior article. Things about cranial imagery, heart issues, gastrointestinal and feeding difficulties, and immunodeficiency. So it is very medical, but it's hard to find this kind of stuff outside of this particular volume. The Charge Syndrome Foundation has a research grant project. You can see this in my presentation. I won't go through it, but these are the kind of issues they're recommending people think about researching. Some of them are very medical, but there's things like behavioral issues, neurological issues, sleep disturbance, and life cycle issues as the children get older. There is a clinical database that the foundation has, which is run by Meg Hefner, who's one of the founders of the foundation. This is Tim Hartshorn with his Charge Lab people from Central Michigan. This is actually an old photo, and several of those people have now graduated and they're working elsewhere. And some of the things they research: educational interventions, fatigue, profiles of ability, anxiety and calendar systems, the use of sensory interventions. And then this is the Bulldog Charge Lab down in Mississippi. And they are looking at these kind of issues: behavioral supports in IEPs, treatment approaches to behavior concerns, functional communication training. If you go to this link, the Cincinnati Children's Hospital, their second conference 2 years ago, was the presentations were filmed, and they are there on, I think it's on YouTube. Texas has its own statewide family organization, very active, very large, very powerful. They have a conference every year, and every 2 years, they invite professionals to speak. And I've been there, I think I've been to 4 of their conferences now, and really enjoyed being in that rather smaller group than the huge Charge Foundation conference, which is always, I find, quite overwhelming. Every year, the state deafblind projects have to do a census of children. And Charge is the big, as you see in the second point, Charge is the biggest etiology. When they're looking at the causes of the deafblindness, charge is the biggest one, which it has been for about 5 or 6 years now, which is quite remarkable. It used to be thought very small scale and very rare, but it's grown a lot. I've been in the field 37 years and I've seen the population change very dramatically. This is the first child I ever worked with. This is James in London. Here he's about 4 years old or 5 years old. And looking back, what strikes me about the early population is how uncomplicated we thought they were very complicated, but compared to the young children now, they were quite uncomplicated, especially in terms of their medical situation. And this picture kind of sums up a much more common picture of early experience. And I won't leave that there very long because you're all familiar with that. This was at the Charge conference, the last one in Chicago. On the way into the barbecue and the party on Saturday night, there was a table at the door loaded with medical equipment, latex gloves, hand sanitizer, tube feeding equipment, and all that kind of stuff. This is at the end of the night. All the stuff that was piled up was almost all gone. And it just struck me as, it says something very powerful about the syndrome, that at a big celebration event, you would provide all that kind of stuff for the families because it's so needed. I'd worked with children with charge for quite a few years before I ever met a child with a gastrostomy tube, for example. We just didn't see them in the beginning. I think because children who had that level of medical need probably were not surviving. And I can remember, we were an early intervention service in London. I can remember taking calls to refer newborn babies with charge. And it wasn't that unusual to get a call saying the baby had died. Before we even met them, the baby had passed away. And also, I didn't see a child with a trach for a long time. Now, of course, G-tubes and trachs are not routine, but they're very, very common. And I'm sure you know that the acronym was based on these 6 anomalies. And at the time, they were thought to be the main anomalies in charge. They knew there were a few others, but they thought they were the main ones. And in 2005, I counted 38 anomalies. This is some of them. Thing that, of course, the gene mutation was discovered the year before. There's facial palsy, there's all sorts of issues with cranial nerves, semicircular canal problems, dental issues, sense of smell anomalies, seizures, immune deficiency, sleep apnea. The cranial nerve anomalies are particularly prevalent with nerves 1, 2, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And this diagram shows what they control. The figures in brackets show the frequency with which these occur. These are very old figures, and I think the figures are probably higher. Like nerve 8, hearing and balance, 80%. I would say 95, 96, 97%. Most people with charge have damage to the inner ear on both sides of the head. The facial palsy means that children can't smile. And I've built a career on watching the way children adapt all by themselves and the way they learn and explore and discover things that work without us being involved. And many, many children I know have realized that they're going to have to use their hands to make a smile. And this is a classic example, and good because he's actually using his thumbs to give more pressure. Here's a young lady who's just learning and she hasn't quite got it worked out yet. And here's a boy who can also use his fingers to frown at his mother. This is him in a bad mood and he can't scowl at her, so he's using his fingers to do it. I want to spend some time talking about the things that get overlooked. Certain features of charge are very well known and are addressed by the medical professionals, usually very early once the diagnosis is made. First of all, the dental issues. I want to stress this because dental problems can be a major source of pain in charge. And it's not that unusual when children's behavior has suddenly really got very bad and they become very distressed, very angry, sleep has disappeared. When it's investigated, they're found to have major dental issues which hadn't really been addressed. And the dental issues, there are lots of them. We know that the teeth, they cut their teeth usually late, but sometimes abnormally early. And I've even heard of babies with charge being born with some teeth already erupted. So the dental eruption may be late or early. The children grind their teeth, and I'll talk more about that, but they grind their teeth in order to get pressure, deep pressure input from the teeth grinding. It's a difficult issue to deal with, but I will talk about it a bit. I remember when there was a dental research paper came out that charge syndrome, children tend to have poor quality dental enamel, so it's particularly prone to cavities. And I'm always telling parents about this because I know parents, it happened only last year. A mom came up on Facebook, very upset. She'd really looked after her child's teeth. The child had cavities. They'd gone to a dentist and the dentist basically told the mother off for not looking after her child's teeth properly. Because of course the dentist wasn't familiar with charge and the dentist didn't know about the poor quality dental enamel. The children, if they're eating orally, they often pouch food, almost like a hamster. They put food to the side of the mouth and they can often leave it there for quite a long time. And that in the long run is obviously not good for the teeth or the gums to have all that foreign matter jammed into the side of the mouth. There are certain medications that are not good for the teeth. I'm thinking especially of laxative medications, sometimes anticonvulsant medications for seizure disorder. And after that medication has been administered orally, it would be a good idea to try and encourage the child to drink, if that's possible, some water to try and get it off the teeth. Reflux and vomiting. It's not that unusual for children to have a Nissen's fundoplication, so that it's, in theory, it's impossible for the food to come back up to control an otherwise uncontrollable reflux. And of course, every time the child has reflux or vomits, stomach acids are coming up into the mouth. And again, not good for teeth anyway, but if the dental enamel isn't of good quality, that's asking for trouble. Then there's facial clefting, which sometimes can be very severe, and the teeth can be in all sorts of odd places. This is a picture from one of the German books. The child has had surgery to close cleft lip and palate. And this is the state of the teeth after the surgery. And you can imagine this now is going to need a lot of dental intervention, surgery, to try and get those teeth into a better placement. But it can be done. And I know a family in Germany who recently, I didn't think to put their photos in my slideshow. They have dental photos clearly, from inside the mouth. You can see what a mess the boy's teeth were, the way they were aligned. And after 2 surgeries, you can see how almost normal they are. But of course, surgeries need general anesthetic, and that's very risky with the syndrome. So facial clefting and facial palsy can lead to the teeth being misaligned. And there can also be misaligned teeth. And this is often the cause of severe pain. So instead of growing next to each other, teeth grow into each other. And of course, they grow inexorably over time, and that pressure creates escalating pain. And the children may not react to it too much in the beginning, but after weeks and weeks and months of this development, the pain gets to such a state that the child can no longer bear it. So the message is the children do need to be seen by a dentist, and the dentist does need to be informed about these things so that they can investigate. They would not automatically x-ray for misaligned teeth, but if they're told that this is an issue in charge, then they will obviously go into it. So that was dental issues. Hypocalcemia, I've spelt this the British way. My spelling comes and goes, my American and British spelling. Hypocalcemia means shortage of calcium. Some children with charge don't absorb calcium from their diet, and they might need a calcium substitute given to them. And that can sometimes contribute to growth issues and to small stature. That happens for other reasons, but hypocalcemia will contribute. And then there's also hypoglycemia, where blood sugar levels drop dramatically. And I know from Facebook that there are quite often parents crop up saying this is a problem. And in those periods of low blood sugar, the children get very tired, drowsy, very irritable. They may feel quite cold, but sweat a lot and be very sticky. And they need something that's going to boost the blood sugar. Seizures. We used to say 25 years ago, I was saying that seizures were not part of Charge syndrome. And then about 20 years ago, I started to hear, not very often, but I started to hear about teenagers who had developed seizures. Some just have one seizure and we assume it was related to an infection of some kind, but some develop seizure disorder. Then we started hearing of younger children, and then we started hearing of babies occasionally. It doesn't seem to be statistically very significant, but it is now officially a charge anomaly. Seizure disorder. Migraine is another, and the migraine might be the kind we're familiar with in the head, but it's possible to have migraine in the abdomen. I can remember for years in England, children with charge of all ages behaving as if they had what I called colic. You know, I'm thinking of babies curling up, crying, clearly in pain, something here in the middle of them. And it was Sandra Davenport, one of the founders of the Charge Foundation, who talked to me about abdominal migraine. And what's needed is painkiller until it passes. And sometimes abdominal migraine is related to cyclical vomiting syndrome, which again, statistically is not so common, but it does exist in the syndrome. Retinal detachments. I do a whole talk. I'm doing a talk in 2 weeks for Maryland about charge vision issues. And you know that the retina, which is at the back of the eyeball, in charge, often bits of the retina are missing. And we call those colobomas. And where the retina is missing, there will be a dark patch. So the child will have no vision in that part of their visual field. The problem is around the edge of the coloboma, the retina is abnormally thin. So it's more vulnerable to tearing. And if it tears even a minuscule bit, the fluid in the eye can start to get behind it and lift the retina off the back of the eye, and the retina can gradually detach. There's no pain involved, and usually, if there's not medical intervention, the retina will detach completely over time and the eye will go completely blind. And sometimes if a child's behavior falls off, it might be because the retina is detached. But if the child's got vision in both eyes, the child themselves might not notice, consciously notice, because they carry on with just one eye. And the recommendation is to avoid impact. You don't want anything banging the child's head. Unfortunately, because of their vestibular problems, this is a population of children who fall a lot and who bang their head a lot. And if the retina does detach, it needs to be detected fairly early, and then the child can have surgery to try and put it back. But if the retina has colobomas in it, it's not an intact retina. It was described to me as, imagine you've got a wet Kleenex tissue and you have to stick it on the wall. And if it's a whole wet tissue, you can do that. But if the wet tissue's been screwed up a bit, it's going to be much harder. And if the wet tissue has some big holes in it, it's going to be even harder because it's going to slip down and slide, and you're not going to get it back perfectly. And it has to be done, I was told it has to be done within a couple of weeks of the detachment. Otherwise, those nerve endings die away and there's no point reattaching it. So it's a big worry, I know, for parents. And the retina can detach at any time. It's not just an infant thing. And one family I know, it's happened to their adult daughter fairly recently. And sometimes you need multiple surgeries. I had an accident to my left eye 37 years ago, just after I started working with children with charge. I put a steel spike through my eye accidentally, and my retina detached, and I had 5 operations to put the retina back. They eventually got most of it back, but I don't see anything with the eye. And then the advice as children get older is you don't play American football, you don't play rugby, you don't dive headfirst into the pool, you don't do wrestling, nothing that bangs. If you're playing soccer, you don't give a header with the ball, you kick it with your feet, and those kinds of things. Constipation, a big issue, a big cause of behavioral problems, and at first discomfort and then pain. Dr. Kim Blake in Canada has done a lot of research on the gut motility. And we think as part of a whole pattern of low muscle tone in charge, the gut doesn't move things through as effectively as it should. And at some point, things can stop altogether and build up. And in extreme cases, if this goes on a long time undetected, the child can develop a condition called megacolon, where the colon, instead of being a narrow tube, turns into a huge, big, a doctor described it to me as a bologna, or a mortadella, a big fat sausage. And if there's surgery then to clear the blockage, but it's hard to get the colon back into condition. And I'm a big proponent of colon massage, where you massage, if the child will allow you, they're on their back, and you start on the left with the ascending colon and you massage up in circles. You come to the rib cage, then you go across to the other side and then down from the rib cage. And what you're trying to do is move stuff through the colon. And in extreme constipation, you can actually feel the colon it's almost like a wooden stick or a plastic tube inside the child. If it works, you don't need to use laxative. And some children with charge are on laxative all their lives. at the Chicago conference, we were given badges for our specialties. And I asked for one, ask me about colon massage. And this was my badge. And I spent the whole conference, people asking me why I had a badge with a snake on it. And it was good because then I would explain it was a colon and I'd have to explain what it meant and why I was wearing it. So think about colon massage. Oops, wrong slide. Problems with smell. A lot of people with charge don't have a sense of smell, and when the olfactory bulb is examined, it's not there, or it's malformed or abnormally small. And there's a big link with the natural onset of puberty. If the child has no sense of smell, it's quite likely that they won't go through puberty without some kind of sex hormone therapy. So it could be an early notification to keep an eye on puberty developments. And I was told that most girls with charge go through puberty spontaneously. Most boys don't, but actually it's more varied than that. And if they don't go through puberty, the main reason it needs help to happen is because of advanced bone age. You know, if a child doesn't go through puberty, their bone age accelerates dramatically, and while they're still in their teens, they could start to develop osteoporosis. I couldn't think of the word. Then there are all kinds of obstacles to walking, which I often talk about because parents naturally worry when their child isn't walking, by the time they're 18 months to 2.5. We know that walking can be remarkably late, but there are a whole host of reasons why that might happen. We also know that there are obstacles to speaking and signing that relate to the multisensory issues in charge. Scoliosis, curvature of the spine, partly because of low muscle tone, partly because of breathing difficulties, partly because of low energy, partly because of visual impairment, and some other issues as well. So the Charge Foundation recommends that everyone with charge should be seen by a specialist of some kind, just to have their spine examined once a year. And if there is scoliosis developing, there can be exercises. A good PT can give exercises. An adaptive PE teacher might be very helpful. And in extreme form, the child might be given a body brace to wear, which is obviously uncomfortable. And in the most extreme case, they might have surgery to implant 1 or 2 long rods, usually titanium rods, which are anchored on the spine in order to keep the spine a little more contained and vertical. Difficulties with the immune system. So the children are often very prone to infection, and then a whole range of self-regulation issues, which lead to all kinds of behavioral problems. Now, I've gone through that list in order to be helpful, but I'm well aware that by the time I've gone through that list, you could be sitting there thinking, my God, I thought this syndrome was bad enough, but it's even more involved than I understood. And I'm sorry about that. I feel sometimes I'm like the harbinger of mortality. You know, I come into rooms to give charge talks, and I should almost be in a big black hooded cape with a scythe, because I'm the bearer of bad news. But actually, it's good news that you learn about these things and you know about them, so that you're forewarned, and so that you can also help to tell other people, especially the professionals involved with your child. So I'm going to talk a little bit about deaf blindness and charge. And this is from an article I wrote about educating people with charge. Most people with charge that I have met satisfy the criteria for being considered as having deaf blindness, even if they have some useful vision and hearing. Deafblindness is a disability that is defined in functional, not clinical terms. And for each individual with CHARGE, it's mostly about difficulties in accessing information, not just from the world around them, but even from their own bodies. And I've got some other quotes from a colleague of mine in England saying the same thing, basically. And this is me, again, reminding people, children with CHARGE syndrome are truly multi-sensory impaired, having difficulties not only with vision and hearing, but also with the senses that perceive balance, touch, temperature, pain, pressure, and smell, as well as problems with breathing and swallowing, eating and drinking, digestion, and temperature control. So it's a very, very complex syndrome. And in the education article, I say a good and effective educational program, while being very positive and having high expectations, should always take account of the fact that everything that a child with CHARGE syndrome does is likely to take more thought and attention and concentration and energy and time for them than it does for us. And that's something I say in schools all the time, particularly when the child is sociable and is keen to learn and is a hard worker and is maybe following an academic curriculum. People forget this, that student looks to be doing really well, but that student, this applies to those very able students as well as the ones with significant developmental delay. And we need to remember that. And CHARGE involves many more senses than just vision and hearing. Here is my list of the senses. CHARGE, the most multisensory impaired of all syndromes. Problems with the perception of vision, hearing, touch, proprioception. I'll say more about that in a minute. Temperature, pain, vestibular, smell, and taste. If you're born with CHARGE, it's quite likely that every one of the senses in that list is missing or not working properly. And our senses are all designed to develop simultaneously. So even a sense on that list that isn't impaired is going to be challenged in its development because of the impairments in the other senses around them. So it's very complicated. And I talk a lot about proprioception and the vestibular sense because they're very important, and we see evidence of the problems they create in children with CHARGE. I'm just trying to remember what's coming up in this slideshow. I looked at it last night before I went to bed. I'll say more about those two senses in a moment, but I want to talk about self-stimulation. When the proprioceptive sense is not working properly, one common outcome may be self-stimulation, which creates strong proprioceptive feedback. And I give some examples. Now, proprioception is the sense inside our body that tells our brain where our body is and what it's doing. The receptors are in the muscles and the joints all through the body, and they're stimulated by three things: compression, stretching, and twisting. So if any part of our body suddenly gets more pressure on it, or starts to get stretched, or starts to get turned and twisted, the proprioceptors in that part of the body send a message to the brain, telling the brain that's what's happening to that part of the body. This is the sense that enables you at this moment to feel your ankles, and you can feel your knees. You don't have to take your hand and touch them. You can feel them. And if you move your ankle or move your knee, you feel it even better because you're emphasizing and increasing the proprioceptive stimulation. When you look at kids with CHARGE, these are very common behaviors. They're all part of self-stimulation. And they're behaviors that create strong compression, strong stretching, and strong twisting, squeezing into tight spaces, crossing or twisting the limbs around each other, twisting a foot or a leg around the leg of a chair, binding parts of the body with cloth or string or rubber bands, pulling downwards on the teeth and the lower jaw, grinding the teeth, tapping the teeth with hard objects, hand clapping or hand flapping, leg swinging or kicking, hanging from a bar, jumping up and down, banging the head, hammering objects, standing on the head. And I've got some pictures to show you, and these, again, I'm sure these will be familiar. Here's a young man who can't, who's, I don't know, sitting properly unsupported, but certainly he couldn't stand at this age. We tend to think standing and weight bearing comes before doing what he's doing. And I must be honest, at my age, I couldn't do this. I can stand, but I couldn't do this. It would be much too challenging. He's doing it because standing is so threatening, because it's such an unsupported position. And he's learned the hard way. If you stand unsupported and fall, your head hits the floor very hard. He's giving himself the pressure inputs and stretching inputs his brain wants by doing it in such a way that his head is protected. He's not going to hurt his head here if he falls over sideways. Who taught him this? Nobody. He experimented and learned it himself. Here's somebody chilling out. Very characteristic behavior as the children get a bit older. Head standing, the legs being used very effectively to stabilize the body. And sometimes children get in this position to watch television. They fix their head by standing on it so that they can watch television. Here's somebody chilling out after a busy day at school, squeezing into a tight space to watch the tablet. Somebody else squeezing into, this boy would squeeze into any tight space he could find. And you see, if you think about proprioception, if you think about pressure, stretching and twisting, you can see how that's what these children are getting. I love this picture. This young man has this gorgeous pool in the garden, but I'm assuming the plastic box was used to bring water out to the pool maybe, but that's what he's using. And it's kind of a bit crazy, we would think, but he's much more supported there. He's much more secure. And I would guess he's just happier there and able to play with the water more effectively because his brain isn't having to think about posture control and safety. Here's a wonderful picture of a kid squeezed in, and here's somebody else in a play box. These children have all learned these behaviors by themselves spontaneously because their brains need this sensory input and they need to feel where the body is. That was a little bit about proprioception. The vestibular sense is more complicated, and I wrote this, in the American book. Of all the many sensory impairments associated with CHARGE syndrome, absence of or significant damage to the vestibular sense is perhaps the most far-reaching in its implications, the least understood, and the most overlooked. And I talk a lot about it. I'm going to skip these. This is a diagram showing what you should find in the inner ear on both sides of the head. It's greatly enlarged. At the top, that thing like a snail shell is the cochlea. Everything else is the vestibular apparatus. All these things are very small, hollow, and very fragile. They're filled with fluid, and on the inside, they're all lined with nerve hairs, which move back and forth as the fluid moves. And the cochlea is the organ of hearing. Everything else, the vestibular apparatus, when the head moves, the fluid in that apparatus moves, and the direction that it pushes the nerve hairs tells our brain what the head is, where the head is and what it's doing. And in charge, this whole apparatus can be very damaged. It may be missing completely. It may be malformed, especially the semicircular canals. And it may anatomically be all there. Children have a CT scan and it shows everything is there. What the scan won't show is whether it's plugged in, if you like, whether it's neurologically connected to the brain, and the chances are it isn't. So you get significant vestibular dysfunction. And we know from Jean Ayres, a major occupational therapy researcher, the vestibular system is the unifying system of all our senses. All other types of sensation are processed in reference to the basic vestibular information. The activity in the vestibular system provides a framework for the other aspects of our experiences. So this is a very, very important sense, probably the most important of all the senses. If vestibular function is not working in a child, we see a number of things. Low muscle tone. Most of the children tend to have very floppy muscles. They don't like moving. They have very poor head control and a very poor ability to resist gravity. They show very strong postural insecurity if you lift them up and hold them upright. And they show a very marked preference for being flat on their back or on their side. They like to be right down, fully supported on the floor, on a table, on a couch. They show delayed mobility, and the movement patterns, they often don't crawl in a conventional way. They scoot on their back. They often look over the top of their head, see something, point their head towards it, and then they push with their feet on the floor and they go head first till their head hits the thing they're aiming for. And then they can roll over on their side and grab it and play with it, bite it, or whatever they're going to do. They do side winding. They sometimes do butt scooting, where they're sitting up and moving around on their butt. And they do the 5-point crawl, where they use 2 arms, two knees, and the forehead. And developmentally, they go backwards first, and then they learn to crawl forwards. The problem with that is, of course, you can't see where you're going. Physical therapists want children to crawl because that alternating pattern, where if the right arm comes forward, the left leg comes forward, helps children develop good bilateral awareness. But children with charge still develop a certain level of bilateral awareness, even if they never crawl. It's probably slower than normal, and it takes longer to develop. But I know children who've been pushed into crawling and pushed, and it's a question of priorities. How much time and energy are you going to take away from other things if you're putting it into trying to get the child to crawl? And I'm not a therapist, so you'd need to consult the therapists on that. We see the W sit, where they sit on their legs and they splay the lower legs out to the side. They often seem to see and hear better on their back than if they're sitting upright. So I've learned over the years, if I'm trying to assess vision and hearing and fine motor skills in a child, if they like to be on their back, I'll do it with them on their back. I will try and get them upright just to compare, but I would assume that I'll see much better use of vision and hearing when their brain is available, because it's not worrying about physical safety and postural control. They often have poor bilateral coordination, and it can be very slow to develop. They get very tired very easily, as I've already mentioned. And most interestingly enough, the sense that plays the biggest part in us developing good self-regulation, that ability to be alert but calm, not to get hyper and go crazy, and not to get so spaced out that you end up drowsy and falling asleep, but to keep yourself at a good level of arousal. That's very difficult for many, many people with charge of all ages. And it's no coincidence that there's such a high level of vestibular dysfunction and such poor self-regulation. And the physical therapist who used to work at Perkins School said this in one of her talks: for children with charge syndrome, gravity sucks. And it sucks literally because it pulls them down and they can't resist, but it also sucks metaphorically because it's for them, it's a kind of damn nuisance, really. And it takes a lot of effort and energy. Early mobility, we see rolling, sidewinding, back scooting, bottom shuffling, 5-point crawl. Sometimes you see regular crawling. And here's a child doing a 5-point crawl. You see how his forehead is down for stability. And it's good to remember that equilibrium or balance, people call the vestibular sense the balance sense, but it's only one of the balance senses, because proprioception and vision play a big part as well. Now in charge, all three of these may be damaged and not working, so it's hardly surprising that walking can be very delayed. And some features of walking, children use walkers very effectively. And sometimes therapists don't approve, but I'm a big fan. This is a very old photograph. I don't know where I got this, but it's one of my all-time favorite charge photos. This boy confronting the world. This kid's on his way. And, you know, if you live in the middle of Indianapolis, this wouldn't be a good idea. If you live there, then it's okay. And if you're worried the child is all on his own, if you look closely on the left of the picture, you'll see he's not on his own. He's got a minder there, and I'm sure his minder would intervene if there was a crisis. So walkers are quite a good idea. One of the fairly new things, I saw an adult with charge at a conference using hiking poles, and I didn't know who he was. And then I mentioned it to someone and she said, oh, that's my son. I didn't know. And she said, yes, hiking poles. Well, I talked about it to a family in England. This is the girl in England. She was, I think, 12. She was walking, but only if she held on to an adult. She'd never walked by herself. She had to hold on to an adult. They bought hiking poles, and from the moment she got them, she walked independently. Quite remarkable. Now, I can't guarantee that would happen to your child if you gave them hiking poles, but it worked for her. Here she is at the seaside. I talked about this in Texas last year, and a few weeks later, a mom in Texas sent me this picture of her much younger daughter, who again could only walk with an adult for support, and with the poles was able to walk even on uneven, unstable surfaces. And as you can see, was very excited about it. A problem was she's an American Sign Language user, and you can't sign with hiking poles in your hands. But they do come with wrist straps, so maybe you can let go of the poles if you can sign with them dangling. Maybe you can't do that. But anyway, I just wanted to share the idea of walking poles or hiking poles. The children have a rolling gait. They often have very flat feet with the knees bent. They sometimes tap their feet hard on the floor several times before they step to feel their feet. And sometimes they walk up on tiptoe, not because they have an orthopedic problem, but if you go on tiptoe, you tighten all the muscles in the foot, the calf, the thigh, and the butt. And that tightening gives extra proprioceptive information, so your brain knows better what's happening with your feet and with your legs. The feet often roll inwards and the knees knock together sometimes. Some kids walk with the arms extended to the side like a tightrope walker. Or I've seen kids do this. They extend the arms in front, and sometimes they'll do this. And I think they're using it the way, you know, in airplanes, they used to have, what's it called? Crosshairs, is it? When you're shooting at something, you have crosshairs. They'll do this with their thumbs. Or I know a boy who used to point his 2 index fingers and lift them slightly, and he would walk following them. I knew a boy in Texas who clapped as he walked, and the clapping helped move him forwards, but it also brought him into midline to compensate for the lack of vestibular information. Children often walk with their fingers, their hands clenched, fingers crossed, and sometimes they walk with their teeth clenched. It's not unusual to see a child who is walking with something in their mouth that they're biting on, and it might be their shirt, it might be a toy, it might be a specific chewy thing which they have from the therapist to get some deep pressure. That biting helps their brain know where their head is, and you need to know where your head is, especially if you're walking. And I've done this with a couple of children. I've asked them to walk without that in their mouth, and they won't walk unless they're holding on to me. But the moment that goes between their teeth, they walk by themselves. Or they still walk without the teeth clenched, but their gait falls apart. They slide the feet on the floor, and there's a great danger of falling over sideways. So it's good to allow the child to be doing things which are functional adaptations, rather than our assumption, oh, that's crazy, or, oh, he's too old now to have that in his mouth. And when people say to me, oh, she sucks her fingers, I think it's good to know, is she sucking her fingers, or is she biting on them, or is she pushing them up against the roof of her mouth? Because they're all quite different outcomes of that behavior of putting your fingers in your mouth. We need to be much more careful observers of what the children are doing than we tend to be. And the last behavior I see very often is where the child is going to walk. They have to launch themselves. Often they do in England, we call it the bum bounce, where you lean against a wall and then you push your butt back and it shoves you forwards. I have a very old dog who has dementia, and he's asleep next to me at the moment. And I've seen him do a bum bounce now because he's very shaky and he falls. And I've seen him stand back, get his butt on the wall, and then push and launch himself forwards. You didn't need to know that, but I was over the moon. I'm easily pleased, you see. They fix their eyes on something. So they'll look at a picture on the wall, or they'll look at the door handle, and they'll walk to it. But they have to keep their eyes fixed. And if you tap them on the shoulder and they turn, they go right down. They're holding on with their eyes. Now, we know that the formation of the colobomas in the eyes in charge tends to mean that the upper visual field is missing. So many children with significant retinal colobomas don't have an upper vision field. So it's like wearing a hat pulled too low. And in order to look forwards, they need to do this. They need to extend the head to lift it up. Parents have said to me, we've been told he has no upper vision field, but we think he's blind in the lower vision field, because when he's walking, he doesn't see things, not just small things on the floor, but things like a coffee table or a bench, and he falls over it. And I think it's because the child is extending his head up and using his vision to aim for a target. So he's not looking down there. He's lifted his visual field and he's not paying attention. It doesn't mean he doesn't have a lower vision field, but in walking, independent walking, his vision is being used for stability and for directionality. So that's just by the by. And then I talk about postures again, and I'll speed up. And I'll say, these postural behaviors have always been present, but largely unseen. When they are noticed, there's often amusement because the postures seem weird, or the child is corrected with no attempt to understand or recognize or honor what the posture means and what function it serves. And this is my hypothesis. We know that the brain is connected to the body only through the senses. If you don't have any senses, your brain doesn't know anything at all. And we know in charge, many or all of the senses are not working properly in some way. And because of that, I think most people with charge are not in touch with their bodies very well, or they don't feel their bodies very well. And they compensate by exaggerating, looking for stronger sensory information to tell the brain where they are and what's going on. And we see a whole range of postural behaviors to compensate for this and to increase especially proprioceptive input. And I'll show a lot of photos. So there's a whole range of postures involving the head. Incidentally, I've been talking for 1 hour and 10 minutes, and I meant to ask if this was helpful to you, and I forgot. I get so wrapped up in this, but I hope it is helpful, and I hope I'm not just telling you stuff you know well. Children often jam things. This bucket isn't just on the head, but it's jammed tight, and it could be a hat. It could be an adult sweatband to go around the wrist, which the child has stretched an impossible distance to get it on their head. Where is my head? I need to feel it better. Children who can't stand unsupported can do pretty phenomenal things to get pressure on the head and down through the spine. This is more like Olympic level head standing. I have so many photographs of children doing this kind of headstand. And of course, by going upside down, the children may be getting some residual vestibular input. There might be bits of the vestibular system that are working, and this position might be giving them some vestibular sensation, but they're certainly getting a lot of deep pressure through the head and the spine by being upside down. Then there's probably the most common charge posture, which is bending one knee and bringing the other ankle up on the knee. It gives you massive tactile and proprioceptive information about the bottom half of your body. It tells your brain exactly where the bottom half of your body is and that it's fixed. It's absolutely fixed and stable. It's not going to move. You're not going to fall. There's not going to be a nasty surprise. And once you've done this with your legs, your brain can focus on other things. It's about availability and attention to the important things. Here's a much younger child doing it. Here's a favorite picture. Long rides in a car can be very tedious. And if your legs are just dangling in space, that can be quite concerning. It's a classic posture for going to sleep. How do you go to sleep if your brain is anxious about the fact that it can't feel your body and you don't know if you're going to fall over? Well, you bring one ankle up on the other knee. This young lady is also getting massive extension and stretching by putting her hands behind her head. These are like favorite pictures that I like to show. Here's a boy in California who I've worked with. And he is, I don't know if his mom's watching, but this is an Indiana child. his mom sent me this picture. He's on a sun lounger. He's realized that he can weave his legs through these straps and get the support from them. So his brain knows that he's fixed and he's okay. So I'm looking at the children's behavior. I'm looking at how they self-stimulate, and I'm looking at the postures they use, which is part of self-stimulation. And I'm saying, what kind of sensory information is he getting from this? And it's partly touch, but there's also proprioception and pressure coming in. Now, there is a particular link between the vestibular sense and the visual sense. We have to remember that vision drives posture. If you don't have any control over your posture, you can't really use your vision because your eyes have to point at the thing you're looking at. You know, you can hear all around you, you can smell things all around you, but you can't see things all around you unless you can organize your eyes to look at them. And if you've got low muscle tone and vestibular issues, that can be very challenging. There is a reflex, the vestibulo-ocular reflex. And the clinical definition is in normal head rotation, the eyes move in the opposite direction to the head and at the same speed to stabilize the visual image on the retina. Well, what does that mean? All it means is, if you look at me, I'm going to look at, there's a picture on the wall behind me. It's on my right side. And I'm going to look at that picture. I've got enough visual acuity to see the picture. Now I'm going to move my head in all kinds of directions. And I never once stopped looking at the picture. As my eyes were going all over, they kept looking at the picture because my vestibular sense in my inner ears was enabling me to do that, not my visual sense. I need vision to see the picture, but if I don't have a vestibular sense working, when I move my head like this, my eyes go with it and I lose the picture, and then I have to search and find it again. And if that is the situation, you need to find a way to stop your eye moving by stopping your head moving, by stopping your body moving. Otherwise, your vision's going to be pulled away. And when children with charge want to use their vision, they do a whole range of self-taught strategies to fix themselves. This child gets on her back, brings one ankle up on the knee, and then holds the book above. Here's an older child doing some phenomenal leg weaving. Again, it tells the brain you're really fixed and everything's okay, and then you're free to think about it. This is a guy at one of our picnics many years ago. He's been kicking a soccer ball around. He had an amazing ability. Every time he kicked a soccer ball, it went directly behind him. He always missed the ball and then his heel got it coming back. It was interesting. And the more I tried to teach him to kick it with his toe, the more he couldn't do it. He's very tired, and he's seen his grandmother's cell phone. He's rolled over on his side, picked up the phone, put one ankle up on the other knee, and now with great facility, he's scrolling through her phone book. Here's a young man on a couch. He's got a tablet beneath him. He's on his knees and his hands, but his forehead is resting on the arm at the side of the couch. Brilliant, brilliant creative solution to the problem of maintaining your gaze in a fixed position long enough to enjoy what you're doing. This is a guy I know in Germany. This photo is taken from above. His legs are up on the back of the couch, and he's semi-upside down and using his thumbs very effectively and playing the upside down. And here's an even older child taking a break, and she's on her bed. As you can see, her head is twisted right round and underneath, and she's looking at her cell phone. And what she's done, again, she's fixed her eyes by fixing her head, by fixing her body in this way. And here's another solution. There are so many ways children come up with to do this. And what they're saying is, I fix my body to fix my head, to fix my eyes, so I can use my vision in the best, most reliable, and most comfortable way possible. Now, nobody wants this child doing this for the rest of their life, to look at their tablet. But at the moment, we have to interpret and recognize the brilliance of this solution and the reason why they have to do it, which tells us we need to work a lot more on postural control, on muscle tone, on saving reactions. We need to get the therapists in. We need to think about things like swimming and horse riding, maybe deep pressure massage and all those kinds of strategies. So I'm not saying, okay, leave the children in these positions forever, but we need to recognize what they're doing. Here's a young man watching television upside down on the edge of the couch. Here's somebody the other way around with the head and the torso on the couch and the legs down on the floor. This is a position, when I see this position, sometimes this might be for a different reason. I think sometimes children with breathing problems do this extreme extension to try and open the airway. And I think sometimes children who are very prone to constipation do it. The last thing you want if you're severely constipated is to flex forwards. And this extension is a way of easing the discomfort. Postures involving hanging over a swing. You've already seen some pictures of this. Here's a boy hanging over a pole. Anything he could hang over on his belly, he would do it. Here's somebody else doing it a different way. Postures involving the hands. This is a teenager who's out for a walk, and he's sitting temporarily on a chair. It's not his familiar chair. He's not feeling secure, so he does this brilliant tips of the fingers and thumbs pushed together very, very hard. And here he is again, same boy. He's out for a walk. You see his long cane is parked behind him, and he's sitting on a stool. There are no armrests, so he's pushing the fingers together. It brings him into midline, and it helps him to confirm that his body is stable and not falling. This is a baby. Babies do not cross their fingers because they don't know how to do it. It's not an orthopedic problem. This is a voluntary behavior, and it's an adaptive functional behavior because it's helping him know better where his body is, especially where his hands and his arms are. Here's an older child who I know that I was sent the picture with a question. He walks normally, but if you ask him to stand still, before he stops walking, he has to clench his hands behind his back. And then he can stand still, unsupported. When you tell him he can walk again, he starts walking first, then he gets his arms back and just normal swinging. What this posture does through the extension of the shoulders and the chest backwards is give him better information about his body, because standing still is much harder than walking even. And that makes sense in the context of charge. And then there's planking. Children who can't weight bear and stand unsupported can plank. And again, I have lots of pictures of these. Here's somebody in a doctor's waiting room, pretty stressful situation. Why not do a bit of yoga? You know, so many of these postures parallel yoga, and you think of yoga, better postural control, better mind-body connection. There's a spiritual side of it, but there's also a self-regulation, calming, emptying the brain of stress kind of side. But these children don't have a yoga instructor. They've come up with this all by themselves. Here's somebody who's even fallen asleep while he's planking. Again, not something I would be capable of doing, even if I tried. We see lots of propping on the arms. This is another of my favorite pictures. I love this picture so much. And then we see squeezing. The boy is at the bottom of the television table, as you can see, jammed into a tight space. Here's somebody under a floor cushion. This is a girl I worked with in California. The couch is on the left, the wall is on the right, and she's down between them. You can see her feeding tube dangerously extended over the top, but she needed to calm down by squeezing into places. So these behaviors often are helping the children to calm. And also, many of them answer the question, where is my head? We see rhythmic head weaving, head binding, head holding and tapping, head pressing, head standing, jaw clenching, teeth grinding, or biting and chewing on something, as I said. Here's an interesting picture that the fists pressed hard against the sides of the head and the index fingers isolated to help give a direction for visual gaze. Very, very creative. And here's, you know, the children often like to bite on their own clothing. There's now a whole range of commercially produced neckerchiefs specifically for that purpose. And now there's silicone jewelry. You know, the old Chewies used to be very OT clinical. Now there are all sorts of phenomenal designs, and you can go to town and probably spend a fortune. And climbing. Children who can't stand unsupported can climb up a climbing wall because they have so many points of support compared to standing. And a quote from Jean Ayres that's good to remember: after air to breathe, postural security is our next most urgent priority. In other words, if our airway is threatened, it produces a huge rush of adrenaline to open up the airway and to protect ourselves. The next biggest rush of adrenaline is if we lose our postural security, or if we think we're losing it. If we fall over, if we have a vestibular sense, there's a reflex called the protective reflex or the saving reflex. If I fall forwards, that reflex, I don't even think, the reflex kicks in. It's triggered by my vestibular sense, which doesn't just tell my brain I'm falling, but it tells me I'm falling forwards. So my hands go forwards and my head comes back. If I go backwards, it tells me to flex my body and bring my head forwards. If I go to the right, it tells me to put my arms to the right and move my head to the left. If you don't have good vestibular function, when you fall down, you go like a tree that's been chopped and your head hits the floor very hard. And because this quote tells us why the children need to do all the things I've been showing you in order to fix their bodies. And I think the postures I've been showing you, often it's to locate the body, to give the brain a better idea where the body is and where the head is. It's to confirm postural security, so you know you're safe, so your brain can concentrate on other things. It's to fix the body, to fix the head, to fix the eyes for visual tasks. It might sometimes be to ease the discomfort of chronic constipation. It could be to open the airway. And in almost every case, it's to self-regulate. And it's either to calm yourself down or to wake yourself up. And it could be both. And it could have either effect. And if we're thinking what helps, well, it's very good to get advice from a physical therapist and an occupational therapist. You have to think about activities which improve strength, muscle tone, and controlled movement. Activities which reinforce the body-brain connection. And examples might be Tai Chi, yoga, wrestling, climbing, dancing, adapted PE, horse riding, if these are not contraindicated because of the risk of retinal detachment. Activities which provide deep pressure inputs, jumping, trampolining, deep pressure massage, swimming. Just going underwater, the brain feels the body much more because water pressure is all over the body, and there's massive resistance when you try to move. It's why hydrotherapy is so good for people with charge. It's also why children with charge tend to be addicted to swimming pools. You go to a charge conference and go to the pool, and those kids will be in the pool all day if you let them. And one of their party pieces is to take a deep breath and sink right to the bottom. They want as much pressure as they can get. And they're remarkably good at holding their breath and bursting to the surface just in the nick of time. Though, of course, somebody does need to be there making sure everything's okay. Binding, and of course, therapists often recommend things like a pressure vest or cuffs or a weighted blanket. Good physical supports and appropriate postures for functioning. The PT at Perkins, again, spandex is the best friend of children with charge. Those two blue things are wrist weights to increase proprioceptive feedback in the arms. You can get them for the ankles as well. It's good to think about lots of variety in posture, not leaving the child in one posture too long. Many of these younger children will be on their backs all day if we let them. So we need to facilitate some variety. The children will need regular periods to reorganize themselves. That might be when they adopt the postures I've been showing you. And I use the word rest in a strange way because we think of rest as maybe lying down, maybe sitting in a comfortable chair, maybe closing the eyes and doing deep breathing. Sometimes a rest period means running around the schoolyard or bouncing up and down or spinning around on the spot, looking at the ceiling fan above you. But they need breaks. Sometimes they're called sensory breaks. But they're likely to need those. And then more deaf-blind, we need controlled environments. So we might need to think about visual clutter, auditory clutter and lots of noise. We might need to control movement in the room. We might not want too many strong smells. We might not want heaters or air conditioners blowing on the child because it could all be distracting. We can teach the children strategies, but we also need to honor their self-taught strategies that I've been talking about and showing you. In our teaching, we need to use strategies that are motivational to that individual child. And in language and vocabulary work, we need to think about appropriate vocabulary for things like body parts, physical feelings, emotional states, and desired activities. Those notes are for teachers, really. I mean, a lot of thought goes into seating for children with charge, and you do need help with that. I forget the name of the chair on the right. It just folds. They're quite cheap and they fold flat. It's just wooden slats held by the fabric. Somebody gave me this picture. They bought one for their child with charge for the group they were in. And it was so popular that other kids got them as well, even though they didn't have charge. And you see them here in possibly story time or circle time. There's a range of therapy aids. These are cushions for sitting on that stimulate more active sitting on the seat. And here's other versions. I worked with a teenager with charge who was having emotional outbursts, and I watched a long math session at school. He was very good at math, but he was in a regular chair at a regular table, and he stooped more and more and more as the half hour went on. And I suggested a better chair, one that was a little higher because his knees were up high, something with armrests. But I also suggested an OT assessment. The OT gave him a therapy ball to sit on. Now, I would never do that. I'm not a therapist. And I went back to the school and he loved that therapy ball. And he could sit much longer, much more upright. And the whole lesson, his butt was just moving the ball back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it was helping him feel his body and maintain better posture, not get so uncomfortable. So to me, that would have been counterintuitive. The last thing I would have done with this huge teenager who had behavioral outbursts was give him a therapy ball to sit on. But, you know, that's why we have OTs and that's why we consult them. Sometimes children are better off standing. Again, it's counterintuitive. If you've got all these problems and balance problems, shouldn't you be sitting down? But sometimes standing up gives a better sense of the body. These children in the second picture are on rocking boards as well, which might be a little over the top, but who knows? But, you know, consult with your therapists to see what they can come up with and what they can recommend. And on a very simple level, an angled desktop could be useful. If you have charge and stuff is down on the table, you've got to lean forwards and you have to flex your head forwards to look down. Heads are very heavy. And if you've got low muscle tone, if you've got breathing difficulties, if you've got major vestibular issues, once you bring your head, if you rest your head upright on your spine, you can bear the weight of it. The moment you bring your head forwards, you've got a battle to keep it up. And very often the children over time lose the battle and they prop on the table and they prop their head. Sometimes if you can raise the desktop, these are from IKEA, I think, but teachers of the visually impaired often have a range of angled desktops. Just bringing it up means that the child doesn't have to flex forward so much, and it might give them a lot more energy and focus and attention just by that simple remedy. And I say here, I believe that posture should be included as a self-stimulation or self-regulation behavior for people with charge. Now, what am I? Oh, and at the Charge conference in Orlando 3 years ago, a lot of the sessions, breakout sessions, were about movement, walking, wrestling, recreational activities. And the poster sessions were looking at the things I'm talking about. So I was very pleased about that. I'm jumping through things now at the end of this talk, but there's 20 minutes left. Oh, somebody's typed something. Oh, right. Yes, it's a message to you. Okay. Communication. People often ask me about communication issues in charge. I think it's with any child with charge, it's good to sign with them right from the beginning. If they're going to speak, signing with them will not stop them speaking, and it won't delay their speaking. It might well accelerate their speaking. Children with charge can use all sorts of communication modes, expressively and receptively, and their needs can change over the long time span, but also from day to day or moment to moment. And it's not unusual for children to hear speech and understand it, but to sign back, because you need much more than hearing to speak. You know, we don't speak with our ears. So that wouldn't be so unusual. And it's important not to assume that a child who hears and understands speech but doesn't speak is being naughty or being lazy. I mean, everybody can be naughty or lazy, but that shouldn't be the first thing we assume that a child with charge is doing. And I bet all your kids can be naughty and lazy lots of the time, but they also have charge syndrome. And I won't go into that anymore. Auditory considerations. There's a whole range of ear malformations, as you probably know, the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. There are brain malformations which affect processing, auditory processing. There's the suppressed immune system, so ear infections are remarkably common and persistent. The children often bang their heads a lot, and that has not just a danger of retinal detachment, but damage to the ear, both to the bones in the middle ear, but also to the cochlea itself. There's malformations, of course, of the cochlea and the vestibular apparatus. The children like to be on their backs. So in the early years, you might want to do your auditory assessments with the child flat on their back. It is such a good idea to do. There may be a whole range of behavioral issues associated with deafness. The children may well have sensory integration dysfunction. The children probably have sensory hierarchies. So when they have lots of energy, they might be much more tuned into vision than hearing. When they get very tired and they're flat on their back, all they can see is the ceiling. Suddenly they might pay attention to their hearing. So you have to think about attention as well. And then finally, deterioration. We don't totally know why, but we do know that some children go more deaf with time. And there are a number of theories why that happens. But we also know children who seem to hear better over time. And again, we don't know if they actually hear better or if they're just attending better. So there are lots and lots of variables. And somebody's kindly just told me, you know, I always say, if you want to know something, ask a parent. The seat on the right is a Howder Hug sensory seat. Howder Hug, nice name. Certainly very popular. I picked that up. So that's the auditory considerations. There are lots of health issues that get in the way of education. And when I'm in schools and children need high level of medical intervention, we talk about the health issues. There often needs to be a paramedic or a nurse available. And I know children who've got a full-time nurse and a full-time intervener or classroom aide with them all the time. We need to balance health and educational needs as far as possible. And we need to make sure that we're building healthcare into the child's educational program. So they're learning a vocabulary for things like ventilator and suction and G-tube and so on. I'll show this just because you might need a laugh at this point. Somebody asked on Facebook once about good bags to carry all the child's medical type and paramedical equipment. And one mother posted this and said, she gave details of the bag. And she said, I always call it my oh shit bag. When there's a sudden crisis and the boy needs suctioning or something like that very urgently, and you think, oh shit. And I really, the name really appealed to me. And I got permission to show this, and I said, I won't use your name. And she said, oh, you can tell people if you like, but I won't tell you. But anyway, it's a nice idea. And then somebody asked about medical equipment, storage, and various people posted various pictures. And here's, one of the pictures that came up. What am I talking about next? Management issues. No, I'm speeding up. I wrote an article and it was a quote from a physical therapist. Why are children with Charge syndrome so lazy? And this particular therapist had worked, I think, with 3 children with Charge, and she found all of them very lazy because they liked to lie down all the time. Well, she didn't know about Charge. And she naturally assumed, because these kids seemed quite bright and quite able, that they were just being lazy and trying to avoid things. So I wrote the article. I found 21 Charge issues, each one of which causes fatigue, compared to people who are developing normally and don't have that anomaly. And it's pretty devastating. You take any one of these: breathing problems, anemia, sleep problems, heart problems, constipation, seizure disorder, hearing impairment, vestibular, you know, every one of these, you're going to have to put more time, more energy, more concentration into what you're doing. Put them all together. And the real question is, why do children with Charge syndrome get up? Why do they walk? Why do they scoot around the room? Why do they look at things? Why do they put things in their mouth and bite them? Because they'd be perfectly justified in doing absolutely nothing, it seems to me, when you look at information like this. I'm really jumping now. I've left the hardest thing till last, mostly because I don't know what to say about it, of course. Oops. I made a list, you know, what is charge behavior? And I came up with this, and this will ring a bell with you. Impulsivity, high anxiety, obsessions, very persistent self-stimulation, poor self-regulation, executive function disorder, and then they may fit the bill for some of these labels like ADHD, PDD, OCD, autistic-like behaviors, deaf blindness as a label, multisensory problems, and then there are other labels like laziness, stubbornness, and aggression that people apply. And a long but good quote from Tim Hartshorne. He talks about behavioral difficulties, and he says, some of which may be described as autistic-like and obsessive-compulsive with attention difficulties. There are potentially multiple sources for these difficulties. Multisensory impairments, communication frustrations, and physical pain and discomfort all have been implicated. However, some children with fairly good sensory abilities, adequate communication, and little apparent discomfort may still have challenging behavior. Cognitive impairment has been implicated in some, but not all cases. It seems that likely some neuropsychological problems exist. Recent research supports the presence of executive dysfunction or problems with shifting, initiating, inhibiting, and sustaining actions. Another area being explored is the presence of a regulatory disorder, making it difficult for the child to regulate complex processes such as their sleep-wake cycle, hunger, satiety cycle, their ability to console themselves, to manage their emotions, and to plan their motor activities. And after you read that, you think, wow, this is big and this is complicated. And I'll just talk about this. This was a 4-year-old child I met with Charge here in San Francisco. This is a little shelf above his bed. And every night when I walked in, there were 4 pairs of his shoes lined in pairs against the wall. And each shoe had a sock, all rolled the same way. And I said to his parents, did he do that? And they were amazed that I knew that, because 4-year-olds don't do that. They don't think that way. And at night, he would put his trains always in this order, always this distance apart on the shelf. Then he'd get into bed, they'd read him a story, and then he'd get up again, stand up, turn around, check they were all in the right place, and then he would go to bed. And to me, that was an early warning signal, almost like an early cry for help. My world is unpredictable. I don't have control of my world. My world is full of surprises. I have to find something where I'm in control and it's predictable and it's always consistent and always right. And we see these kind of ordering behaviors again and again. And it seems to me perfectly reasonable to want to do this. I love classical music, especially opera, and I have hundreds of CDs, and they're all around me in my bedroom in alphabetical order by the composer. So Beethoven comes before Brahms, and Mahler comes before Wagner. They're all alphabetical. And sometimes when I'm looking for something, I'll see that I didn't quite get the alphabetical and I have to change them immediately. This is not as weird as we might think it is. At least I don't think it is. And a little bit about executive function. Executive function covers a range of things. And if you read down this list from activation, focus, effort, emotion, memory, and action, you can see a lot of charge issues. Organizing and prioritizing things, initiating things and getting started, which can be very tough for many of the children. Sustaining your attention, shifting your attention, and completing an activity. Regulating your alertness, in other words, good self-regulation. Managing frustrations, modulating your emotions, and keeping a good emotional perspective. And we know many children with charge, if they accidentally knock their pencil off the desk, they react as if it's the biggest tragedy of their life. And it can take a long time to help them to calm down. Remembering things, accessing recall, recognizing and remembering a sequence, monitoring and regulating your actions without being too impulsive, without getting the context wrong or getting the pacing wrong. I mean, all those things we see in children with charge. So the literature on executive function disorder could be very helpful to us. And I'm going to finish on a more positive note. This is a quote that I wrote in London 23 years ago. I've talked about a lot of problems in these 2 hours. I said, I know of no identified subgroup within the population of people with multisensory impairment who have so many medical problems of such complexity and severity, and with so many hidden or delayed difficulties. And yet no subgroup has shown such a consistent ability to rise triumphantly above these problems. People familiar with charge association often speak about iron willpower, great spirit, and a marked sense of humor being distinctive features of most people with charge association. Though as far as I know, this is the first time these particular aspects of the condition have appeared in the literature. And obviously, I believe that even more strongly now than I did 23 years ago. You'll notice then, this wasn't a syndrome, it was still called charge association because the cause hadn't been identified. And remember, that consistent ability to rise triumphantly above these problems happens with your help and your endless hard work and your assistance. And I think it's really important to go away from this talk remembering that so much I've shown you and so much I've talked about comes from the children. It's not just us. They can be curious, they can be exploratory, they can be inventive, they can be experimental, and they can find things that work for them, and we need to respect that, even when the thing that works for them is a pain in the arse as far as we're concerned. And I always say, if it's not dangerous or illegal, we need to spend some time thinking, why would she be doing this? What could she get from that? So how could we give her that in a different way so that this particular behavior we want to reduce could be reduced? That's a good, healthy, respectful way of approaching it. And I think, yeah, I finish again with my email. And that's the end of my presentation with, I make it 4 minutes to go.
Thank you, David, very much.
My pleasure.
Presentation, and thank you all for joining us today. Check out our website for future trainings, and we just wish you all a happy and healthy day.